3 weeks ago, I got a letter that nearly stopped my heart. It was from Margaret, my ex-wife, the one who betrayed me almost 40 years ago. She's dying, and she wants to see me one last time. I've built a whole new life since then. A different wife. A quiet kind of happiness I thought nothing could shake. But just a few lines on paper. And the past came rushing back. Before I tell you what happened that day, hit subscribe and tell me which country you're listening from in the comments. Because this story isn't just about love, it's about forgiveness. When I got that letter, I sat there, silent, on the old wooden chair in front of my little bookshop porch for almost an hour. The paper was yellowed, the ink slightly smudged, that faint scent only letters written straight from the heart ever carry. The handwriting was still the same, tilted gentle, like time itself hadn't worn down the image of the woman who once held my hand in a Vermont winter. But this time every word carried something I was never ready to face. Edward, I'm leaving soon. I was born in a small town where winter lasted half the year, and the kids found joy skating on the frozen lake. Margaret was my sister Evelyn's best friend. Since I was 15, I'd grown used to hearing her laugh echo from the backyard whenever they jumped rope. She was different from any girl I'd known, quiet, humble. Margaret had a way of speaking that calmed you, like as long as she was there, everything in the world was where it should be. We grew up together, studied together, and somehow love just happened. I still remember the day I proposed in the middle of a snowfield, awkwardly kneeling my hands, shaking more from the cold than from fear. She smiled and said, "I've been waiting for that question for 10 years. I married her at 25. We weren't rich, just a small house, an old car, and a sky full of dreams. I served in the Navy for years, gone for months at a time. Every time I left, she'd walk me to the dock, smiling, waving, and I always felt like I left my heart right there in her arms. But life is never certain. When I came back from an 8-month deployment, the house was the same, but her smile wasn't. She spoke less, avoided my eyes. I thought maybe it was stress, or maybe I'd just been gone too long. Then one night she placed a cup of tea in front of me and said, "I need to tell you something." The talk lasted less than 3 minutes, but it split my life in two. She'd had a brief affair with a co-worker while I was away. She cried. Trembling, said it was the biggest mistake of her life, that she couldn't hide it from me. I didn't yell. I didn't break anything. I didn't curse her. I just sat there staring at the empty space where she used to sit every morning, and realized that sometimes love doesn't explode, it just fades away, quietly. We tried to fix things. She apologized. I forgave her. Then came anger, silence, forgiveness again. A loop that never ended. Until one autumn day, I packed a small bag and left. When I turned around, she was standing at the doorway crying. That image of Margaret stayed with me for nearly 40 years. After the divorce, I left Vermont and moved to Portland, where no one knew my name. I worked in a shipyard for a while, then opened a small bookstore by the harbor. Life became quiet, simple. I didn't think much about the past, though sometimes on windy afternoons, the distant church bells brought her back to me, the woman who once taught me that to love someone is to believe they'll never leave you. It wasn't until I was 33 that I met Helen Carter. She made me believe life could begin again, even with a cracked heart. Helen never asked about Margaret, never pushed for stories. She just stayed gentle, patient, as if she understood that my past was something she'd have to love too. But all that peace, all those years of quiet happiness, began to tremble the moment I read that letter. After 40 years, Margaret stepped into my life again, not to ask for forgiveness, but to say goodbye. And what shook me most was her last line. "If you can, I'd like to see you one more time, not to hold on, but to let go." I set the letter down, looked out at Portland's gray-silver sea, and for the first time in years I felt my heart tremble, not from love, but from something deeper. The fear that if I didn't go, I'd carry that unfinished debt for the rest of my life. It took me almost a week to steady myself after reading that letter. Every morning I still brewed my coffee, opened the doors of our little seaside bookstore in Portland, where the smell of salt mingled with the early breeze, and old folks like me began their days with a few worn pages. But after that letter arrived, I couldn't focus on a single line. Each time the door creaked open, I'd look up half hoping, half fearing that Margaret might walk in, as if time itself had turned back. Helen noticed it before I did. One evening while I was straightening the shelves, she softly said, "You haven't answered the letter, have you?" I looked up and met her calm eyes. No anger, no questions, just her voice light as the wind. "If you need to go, I'll take care of the shop. But go with a clear heart, Edward. Don't let guilt drag you back into the past." I looked at her for a long time. Helen wasn't one for many words. She had a kind of peace about her that Margaret never could give me. If Margaret had been a blazing fire that made me forget the world, Helen was the warm lamp that helped me see myself again. I never compared them until that moment. We met at the city library. I used to go there every morning to read the paper. She worked behind the archives desk. One day when I was fumbling for The Old Man and the Sea, she smiled and said, "It's not in fiction. You'll find it under The Sea in Human Life." It sounded odd, but somehow perfectly right. After that, we talked more about books, the ocean, and the quiet loneliness of middle age. We'd both known loss. I'd come from a broken marriage. She was the widow of a sailor lost in a storm back in '85. Maybe that's why we didn't need many words. Silence was enough. When I finally asked her to marry me, she just smiled and said, "Are you sure I don't have much, just old books and a small apartment?" I told her. That's more than enough for a man who once lost the whole world. Our wedding was simple in her friend's backyard. No music, no guests, just the wind and the scent of lavender. For the first time in years, I felt real peace. We opened Miller and Carter's books by the Portland shore. That little shop became our home, a place where growing old felt beautiful, like reading a book that never rushed to its ending. Each night I'd read to her and she'd bring me a cup of chamomile tea in her white porcelain cup. Some nights when the rain drummed against the roof, I thought, if life ended here, I'd have no regrets. Then Laura was born, our only daughter, a gift I never thought I deserved. She had her mother's eyes, and a smile warm as morning light. She grew up among shelves of books, learned to read before she could tie her shoes. Now she's 35, a doctor in Boston. She rarely comes home but calls her mother every night. And every time I see Helen smile at that glowing screen, I feel time passing gently. We spent nearly 30 quiet years that way, calm, slow, uneventful. I thought the past had turned to ash, blown away by the wind. But life never stays still. Last month, Helen started coughing just a little at first, mostly in the mornings. I urged her to see a doctor, but she brushed it off, said it was just the sea air. Then came the dizziness, and I practically had to drag her to the hospital. The results were heavy, her lungs were failing, and she needed close monitoring. That night, as I brewed her tea, Margaret's letter arrived. I couldn't ignore the irony of it. All the woman who once betrayed me was dying, while the woman who'd walked beside me for half my life was fading too. Helen read the letter and sat quietly for a long time. Then she laid her hand on mine and said, "Maybe this is life's way of testing how much forgiveness we truly have. I'm not afraid of you going, Edward. I'm only afraid you'll carry this weight forever and never find peace." Her words caught in my throat. I finally understood love isn't about holding on. It's about giving the other person the freedom to find their own answers. And Helen, with her calm grace, taught me that lesson, one I only truly grasped at 70. I folded the letter and looked out the window. Outside, Portland's sky was pouring rain. Tiny drops fell on the roof, tapping a steady rhythm like a heart quietly counting down. And I knew, soon I'd have to leave this place, to face the past, and maybe to finally close a chapter I thought had ended long ago. Helen was the one who packed the wool coat into my suitcase that morning. Portland was still misty, the air carrying the taste of salt from the sea. She carefully tucked in some medicine, a small notebook, and a photo of the three of us taken in the garden behind our bookshop. When I said I'd only be gone for a few days, Helen smiled softly. "Go," she said. "Don't make promises. Some meetings take 40 years to arrive. You can't measure them in days." I couldn't answer. I just held her thin, gentle hand. In that moment, I realized real love doesn't need many words. Sometimes it's just having someone who trusts you enough to let you go, without fear of losing you. The flight to Charleston took about 3 hours, but my mind drifted backward in time. I could still picture the street where Margaret and I used to walk the old oak tree by the lake, the sound of church bells every Sunday morning. That town was once our beginning, and our ending. I didn't know what I feared more, seeing her again after 40 years, or discovering there was still something inside me I hadn't named. When the plane landed, Thomas Margaret's younger brother was waiting. I recognized him right away, despite the white hair and weary eyes. He shook my hand firmly, said nothing, just nodded, and led me to the car. We drove for over half an hour in silence. Only when the road narrowed toward a small white house did he finally speak. "She's been waiting for you all week," he said quietly. "Kept saying she was afraid you wouldn't come." I couldn't reply. My throat tightened, and all I could see was the image of her standing in the rain. That last day, tears mingling with the downpour. The house was the same old roof vines of bougainvillea spilling over the porch. When Thomas opened the door, the scent of wood and cinnamon filled the air so familiar, it felt like I'd just returned from a long trip, not from another lifetime. Margaret sat by the window where the late afternoon sun slanted through. She'd grown frail, her hair now more silver than brown. But when she looked up, those eyes still the same eyes of the 15-year-old girl who once made me believe that two people could be the whole world. "Edward." Her voice trembled soft as wind. I just nodded and walked over, taking her cold hands in mine. We didn't speak for a while. The only sound was the slow tick of the clock and the pale sunlight falling across her face. Finally, Margaret gave a faint smile. "I thought you wouldn't come. I thought I wouldn't have the courage," I whispered. We talked through the afternoon. She asked about the bookstore, about Helen, about Laura, the daughter she'd only ever imagined, never met. I told her about the simplest things, the smell of morning coffee, the old men who read for free, the way Helen smiles when she hears the waves. She listened as if she were hearing a fairy tale of her own life, one that ended the way hers never did. Then she opened a small wooden box from the drawer. Inside were 2 old wedding rings dulled with time. "I kept them," she said, "because I couldn't bring myself to throw them away." I looked at the rings and felt something I couldn't name. It wasn't love, not regret either. Just a quiet tenderness for a time long gone. As I was about to leave, she started coughing hard. Thomas rushed in, and I helped her lie back on the chair. Her face turned pale, breath heavy. I heard the doctor's voice through Thomas's phone. "Get her to the hospital immediately." A visit that was meant to last a few hours turned into a sleepless night. I sat by her hospital bed, watching the monitor flicker. In that moment, I wasn't the man she'd betrayed, just someone watching a piece of his past slowly fade away. Helen called the next morning. My voice cracked as I told her everything. She paused, then said softly, "Stay with her, Edward. Not because she needs you, but because you need to close that chapter." And so I stayed in Charleston, in that cold white room beside the woman who once broke my heart, waiting for the final dawn of a love that had slept for nearly half a century. When I pushed open the door to Margaret's hospital room, the cold air and the sharp scent of disinfectant made me shiver. She lay there smaller than any memory I had of her. Her hair was white, her skin thin and wrinkled, but her eyes were still the same eyes that once set my heart on fire. She smiled when she saw me, a weak, trembling smile, but peaceful, deeply peaceful. I sat down beside her bed. For a few minutes, neither of us said a word. Only the beeping of the heart monitor filled the room, counting down the seconds she had left. Then in a faint, raspy voice, she said, "I didn't think you'd come, William." I smiled, trying to hide the knot in my throat. I didn't think I would either, Margaret. But I guess there are things that need to be said before it's too late. She nodded, and tears rolled down her hollow cheeks. And so that afternoon we talked like old friends, no blame, no bitterness. Just the unfinished pieces of a story that needed to be closed. She told me about her life after we parted, the second marriage that never brought her joy, the years she spent raising a child alone, and finally the illness that taught her the truth that what matters most isn't who was right or wrong, but who once loved sincerely. I listened quietly, never interrupting. At times I felt like I was sitting across from a ghost of our youth, two people who once believed love could conquer every mistake. But life proved otherwise. Some mistakes can't be fixed, only lived with. As the evening light poured through the window, she reached for my hand. It was thin and trembling, yet her grip was warm. "I know I hurt you," she whispered. "All my life I knew that. But still, thank you for loving me once truly." I answered softly, "And thank you for teaching me that forgiveness isn't weakness. It's how we keep living." We both smiled, the kind of smile two old souls share after surviving the storm, realizing that resentment never holds anything but exhaustion. Before I left, I placed an old photograph on the table beside her bed, taken in 1972, during our first trip to the sea after we were married. I'd kept that photo all these years, not out of love, but because it was proof of a time when we lived with everything we had. She looked at it for a long time, then murmured, "I always thought you hated me." I shook my head. No, I only hated the way we ended. When I stepped out of that room, my shoulders felt lighter than they had in decades. The hallway breeze carried a faint scent of lavender from the hospital garden, her favorite scent. I stopped, turned back toward the closed door, and in that quiet moment, I knew I'd finally closed a chapter of my life. That night back home, I told Helen everything. She listened in silence, then simply took my hand and said, "I'm proud of you, Edward, not because of her, but because of you." Those words filled me with a warmth I hadn't felt in years. In 70 years of life, maybe that was the first time I truly knew peace. No past chasing me, no what-ifs haunting the edges of my mind. But I had no idea that what I thought was the final goodbye would open the door to something entirely unexpected, a twist I couldn't have imagined. Margaret passed away just a week later and left behind a letter with a message that would turn everything I believed upside down. Margaret passed away on a misty morning. I got the call from the hospital while making coffee for Helen. The nurse's voice trembled. She went in her sleep, peacefully. I just said, "Thank you," then stood there for a long time watching the coffee drip into the cup. I thought I'd feel calm, but instead there was this strange emptiness inside me, as if a piece of my past had just been blown away forever. That afternoon I went to the hospital to collect Margaret's belongings. In a small box beside her photo were a few familiar things, an old notebook, a faded silk scarf, and a thick envelope with my name on it, the handwriting shaky, yet still hers. The woman who used to write to me all those years ago. I brought the envelope home. Helen looked at me, nodded softly as if she understood there were things a man had to face alone. I went out to the backyard where the maple tree had started to turn yellow, sat on the wooden bench, and opened the letter. Margaret's voice seemed to come alive through every line. "William, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone. There's something I never had the courage to say while I was alive. Not because I was afraid, but because I knew. Only after I'm gone will you be able to hear it without anger." I read slowly, my heart pounding. In 1985, when we separated, I carried a secret. Mark, the son I said belonged to my second husband, was actually yours. I never told you, because I was afraid you'd give up your future, afraid to destroy what you were building. But now, with time running out, I don't want that boy to live his life in a lie. My hands began to tremble. The letter slipped from my fingers. The wind blew through scattering yellow leaves around me. Each line cut like a blade. Memories I thought had died long ago came rushing back those afternoons when she left without a word, leaving me with a bitterness I never could name. I kept reading, my voice barely a whisper. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I only hope that if you can, you'll find Mark. He lives in Portland, teaching music to children with disabilities. He knows nothing about this. But I believe, when you look into his eyes, you'll recognize yourself. I folded the letter, sat there for a long, long time. Helen came out, placed a hand on my shoulder. I told her everything. She sighed softly and said, "Maybe that's why you had to see Margaret. Not to close the past, but to open what's still unfinished." 2 weeks later, I flew to Portland. I found the Music Center for Children with Disabilities, and from an open window came the sound of a piano and children singing. Inside that sunlit room, a middle-aged man was playing the piano, smiling gently as the kids sang along. I froze his shoulders, his walk, the way he leaned toward the keys. All of it felt like looking into a mirror of my younger self. When he turned around, our eyes met. Something in that look made my chest tighten, a feeling both strange and deeply familiar. I didn't tell him who I was. I just walked up, smiled, and said, "That's a beautiful song. You wrote it yourself?" He nodded. "Yes, for my mother. She passed away last month." I couldn't speak. My throat burned, but I tried to stay composed. I shook his hand, and in that brief touch, warmth spread through me in a way I can't explain. That night I sat by the Portland harbor watching the lights ripple on the water. I didn't know if I should tell him the truth or let things rest quietly. But I realized life doesn't always need clear answers. Some bonds are meant to be felt, not explained. I looked up at the sky and whispered, "Thank you, Margaret. You've helped me see. Forgiveness is the final gift of love." And in that moment I understood sometimes what we think is lost forever can return not to reopen old wounds, but to complete who we are in the final years of our life. I left Portland at dawn when the mist still floated over the water. My heart felt light, at peace, as if every last scar had finally been sewn shut by compassion. If this story reminds you of someone from your past, don't wait. Say the words of forgiveness before it's too late. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, subscribe and stay with me on this journey. Thank you for listening to my story.